All right, in this video we're going to be doing section 9.4, which is solving quadratic equations by completing the square. We're going to take a couple days to go over this skill. So we're going to work on the front side of these notes today, and then we'll look at the back side over the next 2 days. So what we're going to be doing is completing the square. So we're going to recall this skill of squaring a binomial and kind of looking at what pattern is created, and that's what we're going to try to recreate in our expressions. So remember that x plus 3 squared is the quantity x plus 3 times itself. And when we multiply that, we end up with x squared plus 6x plus 9. All right, similarly, x minus 5 squared is x minus 5 times itself. And when we multiply that out, we end up with x squared minus 10x plus 25. All right, lastly, x plus 4 quantity squared follows the same pattern, obviously. When we multiply that out, we end up with x squared plus 8x plus 16. Okay, so we're going to look at kind of the patterns that are created here, but for an expression of the form x squared plus bx, what we're going to be looking at is adding on a constant c, so adding a c to the end, so that it's a perfect square trinomial. And these are all examples of perfect square trinomials. When we create that c value, what we're doing is completing the square. So that's what that process means. Okay, because we're creating that perfect square trinomial, so that's why it's called completing the square. We're finishing off the trinomial so that it's a perfect square. All right, so when we look at some of the patterns, what we'll notice is the relationship between the number in our binomial, so in this case a positive 3, and then these two numbers, okay, or a negative 5 and these two numbers, or a positive 4 and these two numbers. So what we'll notice is that we are always doubling to get our middle value, and then squaring to get our last value. Doubling to get our middle value, squaring to get our last value, doubling to get our middle value, squaring to get our last value. Okay. And then also the relationship between our last value and our middle value, our last value and our middle value, our last value and our middle value. If we take our middle value, cut it in half, and square it, we get our last value. If we take our middle value, cut it in half, and square it, we get our last value. If we take our middle number, cut it in half, and square it, we get our last value. Okay, because of all these patterns, we can continue to follow this pattern, and that's the process of completing the square. So to summarize what this means is we have a binomial x squared plus bx. Okay, what we're going to do is we're going to take our middle value, so b, we're going to cut it in half, so divide by 2, and we're going to square that result. And that is going to be the last value in our trinomial. Okay, so we're adding on the third term to make it a trinomial in the process called completing the square. Okay, so what we'll do again is we're going to take the middle value b, cut it in half, and square it, and that's going to be that last value. Okay, and the reason you do this is kind of because of all these patterns that I went over up here. Okay, so the objective for today is kind of just completing that square. In tomorrow's lesson, we'll kind of look at why we're going to do this and why that's beneficial to do. But today we're just going to focus on practicing that process. Okay, so example 1 is asking you to find the value of c that completes the square. So we're looking for the value of c that makes it a perfect square trinomial. Okay, so we want to follow that pattern of taking b, cutting it in half, and squaring it. Okay, so for a, we're looking at a b value of 12. So we would take 12, cut it in half, and square it. So that would give us 6 squared, which is 36. So c would equal 36. For b, we have x squared minus 26x plus c. So again, we're taking that b value, so negative 26, cutting it in half, and squaring that quantity. So that would be negative 13 squared, which would give us 169. Okay, so c would equal 169. For c, we're going to take our b value of 13, cut it in half, and square it. Okay, in this case, 13 divided by 2 gives us a decimal. It's going to be extremely beneficial if you leave it as a fraction, so please just leave it. We're going to multiply the numerator to get 169. The denominator would give us 4 when we square it. So c would equal 169 over 4. All right, example 2, we're going to complete the square for the expression and then factor the trinomial. So we're going to find that c value, that last value, to complete that square and then factor it. Okay, so in A, again, we're going to start by taking our b value, cutting it in half, and then squaring it. So that would give us 25. Okay, so completing the square, we would end up with x squared plus 10x plus 25. Okay, now factoring this, if we revisit up here, it's kind of messy now, but it always factors into these patterns. So when we look at, it's going to factor into a binomial squared, and this number here is always, we can think of it two ways, half of the middle number or the square root of the second number. Okay. Again, the minus 5 is half of that middle number. Our positive 4 here is half of that middle number. So that's what we can do to factor these. Because we're creating a perfect square trinomial, we know that it's going to factor into binomial squared. So we can always follow this pattern. So it's going to be half of our b value. So this would give us x plus 5 quantity squared. Okay, for b, we have x squared minus 4x. Again, we want to complete the square, so we're going to take our middle number, divide by 2, square that quantity. That'll give us positive 4. So our trinomial would be x squared minus 4x plus 4. And then when we go to factor, it's always half of our middle number, so x minus 2, quantity squared. Okay, our last one, we have x squared plus 7x, and we want to complete the square. So we're going to take 7, cut it in half, square that quantity. So we would get 49 over 4. Again, leave this as a fraction. It'll be extremely important later on. It'll make it so much easier if you leave them as fractions. So our trinomial is x squared plus 7x plus 49 fourths. And this is going to factor into a binomial squared. And again, it's going to be half of the b value is going to be in our binomial. So again, we'll just leave it as a fraction. That'll be x plus 7 halves. Okay, so we're going to stop there for this video in this lesson. Again, because of all these patterns, we're allowed to kind of follow the pattern to do this process of completing the square. And that's going to help us to solve quadratic equations, which we'll go over in the next lesson. So kind of the point of this lesson was to observe the pattern of taking b over 2 and squaring it, and then looking at how we would work these two examples. Your homework will model these two examples as well. All right, please make sure that you're showing your work and submitting it on Google Classroom. If you can do your best to submit just a picture instead of a Google Doc of the picture, that makes it a lot easier for me to see. I'm having some difficulty seeing it when you guys put it in a Google Doc. If you're not able to do it, send me a message and I can give you some instructions to kind of help you out to get it to upload just as a picture. All right, thank you so much, guys.